Russian control has been established over the city of Kostiantynivka.
A statement from the Russian dictator on Kostiantynivka and a warning about dictatorship.
I repeat, this works in our favor.
Quite predictably, Vladimir Putin was afraid to go to Kostiantynivka in the Donetsk region, which the Russians supposedly captured just yesterday. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, today proposed to the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin to hold a bilateral meeting specifically in Kostiantynivka after his statement about the Russians capturing this city. Like, if the Russians really did capture the city, then for Vladimir Putin, surely it wouldn't be a problem to show up there. But instead of showing his courage, Vladimir Putin ran away and only from afar gave the order to continue missile strikes on peaceful Ukrainian cities. But he ordered his personal yacht to be urgently relocated farther away to the Arctic, so that Ukrainian drones wouldn't be able to reach it. But that night, Ukrainian drones paid a visit to Vladimir Putin's hometown. On the night of July 4th, Ukrainian defense forces attacked an oil terminal in St. Petersburg. A massive fire is raging at the site right now. Meanwhile, the Kremlin is preparing Russians for a truly large-scale war. Amid rumors that the Kremlin is preparing for a new wave of mobilization right after the elections in the fall, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation has proposed to cancel mandatory medical examinations for contract soldiers and mobilized personnel, which is exactly what determines their fitness for military service. The Russian Ministry of Defense stated that a military medical board should only be convened if there are visible injuries or obvious illnesses. But for everyone else, it is proposed to automatically declare them fit for military service. And this proposal from the Russian Ministry of Defense came amid other news. Vladimir Putin just yesterday instructed to analyze the involvement of Ukraine's allies in the war, whom he called instigators of the prolonged hostilities. And this morning, the Russian Foreign Ministry has already released a list of European countries that are allegedly directly involved in the war, and so the Kremlin is threatening to strike their territory. My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss this together. But before we start, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment below this video. So, I'll start this episode with tonight's biggest news. Vladimir Putin's victory in Kostiantynivka, Donetsk region very quickly turned into a defeat and even a shameful retreat. The day before, Vladimir Putin pompously put on a military uniform to announce that Russian troops had supposedly captured the city of Kostiantynivka in the Donetsk region completely. During a meeting with the military, the Russian dictator spoke about the supposed successes of the Russian army at the front, and according to him, besides Kostiantynivka, Kramatorsk is also supposedly under Russian control. Here is a quote from Vladimir Putin.
Russian control has been established over the city of Kostiantynivka. I want to note that taking Kostiantynivka is only the first but a very important stage. Yes. The destruction of AFU formations that are still holding out for now. The Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Kostiantynivka fortified area, as you said, is where the enemy has built a deeply echeloned system of fortifications, turning the cities of Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Druzhkivka, and Kostiantynivka into a single defensive stronghold. But with the capture of Kostiantynivka, as I understand it, we should no longer talk about the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk-Kostiantynivka line, but simply about the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk line. Well, of course, also including Druzhkovka, a small but still fortified settlement.
But of course, there is a discrepancy here. If you look at the deep state map, there is no talk of any capture of Kostiantynivka. According to the map, Russian troops are near the settlement, but have not captured it. However, the Kremlin is used to making such statements. Let me remind you, they have already captured Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region twice. Putin embarrassed himself twice by claiming that they had already captured it. And remember, he even invited a journalist to Kupiansk saying that they had already taken it. But in reality, this city is still under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. The Russians have already forgotten how Putin fooled them like suckers, saying that they had captured Kupiansk. And now here is the new victory, Kostiantynivka. I would also like to note that the head of the General Staff of the Russian Federation, Valerka Gerasimov, reported to Vladimir Putin that Russian troops had supposedly established full control over the entire Luhansk region. But according to the deep state map, this is also not true. In addition, Vladimir Putin himself said that massive strikes on Ukraine need to continue. He says that it's about defense industry enterprises, but in reality, as is known, every attack ends up destroying ordinary residential buildings. This was clearly seen on the night of July 2nd in Kyiv. Now back to Kostiantynivka. The spokesperson for the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Major Andriy Kovalev, stated that the information voiced by the filthy mouth of Vladimir Putin is a lie. The military units and subdivisions of the Armed Forces of Ukraine's East Group continue to conduct defensive operations at certain positions within the settlement and on its approaches. There have been cases of small enemy infantry groups infiltrating deep into the combat formations of our troops. Counter-sabotage operations by Ukraine's defense forces are ongoing in the city. In the first 4 days of July, the Russians have already tried to storm this city in Ukraine 11 times.
We are warriors of the Luhansk Regiment, Lyud Brigade. Right now, we are holding the line in Kostiantynivka and fighting directly in the city.
The warriors of the Safari Regiment, Lyud Brigade, are continuing to carry out combat missions in the Kostiantynivka direction today. Alongside our Ukrainian Defense Forces allies, we are holding back the enemy. These statements by the Russian leadership about the alleged capture of Kostiantynivka are nothing more than another round of propaganda that has nothing to do with reality.
So we can confidently say that the statement by the Russian dictator about the alleged capture of Kostiantynivka does not correspond to reality.
The city is holding on. Ukrainian defenders continue to destroy the occupiers and do not allow the enemy to carry out its plans.
So that Putin's latest wet fantasies remain just fantasies.
While the Russian authorities are handing out more medals to their generals for taking the city, we are destroying their infantry by the dozens.
Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes!
But let's just purely hypothetically imagine for a second that the Russians, God forbid, really did completely capture the city of Kostiantynivka and Vladimir Putin is not lying to us. Well, in that case, it means the city is completely under Russian control and they control its security, right? Right. But as it turned out, it was very easy to prove that Putin was lying. Very easy, without even using deep state maps. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, publicly proposed that the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin hold a bilateral meeting in that very same Kostiantynivka after his statements about the Russians capturing this city. Zelensky noted that on the eve of US Independence Day, Putin decided to lie to the whole world and to US President Donald Trump about the situation at the front, but he himself really understands what is happening. That's why even his meeting with the generals yesterday was not held in the fields, but in some bunker or some television studio. I don't know exactly, but definitely indoors. Let's do it this way. Just listen to the echo in this video where Putin meets with Gerasimov. Supposedly, against the backdrop of camouflage nets, supposedly somewhere in the fields, some kind of military headquarters. But the echo is the kind I always heard, for example, in television studios back when I worked in TV. That kind of echo really happens in a large room. So the question is, why are there camouflage nets in a completely enclosed room?
Comrade Mikhail Vladimirovich, the Joint Group of Forces is conducting combat operations according to the plan of the Special Military Operation. Chief of the General Staff, Gerasimov.
Well, let's get back to Zelensky. Zelensky directly called on Vladimir Putin to meet specifically in Kostiantynivka if, of course, he's not a coward. Next is a quote from Zelensky. If Kostiantynivka is now under Russian control, then probably Putin won't have any problem meeting me there and finding diplomatic solutions to finally end the war. But still, he won't cross the front line. The truth is very different from Putin's words. So, what do you think happened literally half an hour after this statement by Zelensky? Vladimir Putin embarrassed himself again. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov publicly admitted that his president is a coward. Here's a quote from Peskov. If Mr. Zelensky is ready to come to Russia, we welcome it. Putin is ready to receive him in Moscow since the capital of Russia is Moscow, not Kostiantynivka. Well, I haven't heard a worse excuse yet. It turns out they only meet in capitals. Well, that's the logic. Now, here's the question. So if Kostiantynivka is already under the full control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, then why was Putin so scared? But that's not all. Vladimir Putin continues to hide his yachts. This time, the super yacht Graceful is sailing along the coast of Norway towards Murmansk, escorted by 2 Russian warships. NATO is reportedly monitoring the passage, and while crossing the Baltic Sea, the vessels were escorted by patrol ships from Germany and Denmark. Moreover, in the photos published by The Telegraph, the yacht is seen sailing next to Russian military vessels, and anti-drone nets are visible on its deck. So Putin is practically wetting himself by now, so he's slapping anti-drone nets on everything, and now they've even appeared on the yacht. But the climax of this story is that it has emerged that Vladimir Putin is now trying to hide this yacht as far away from Ukrainian drones as possible. And now the yacht Graceful is being sent toward the Arctic. And after hiding his yachts and hiding himself in a bunker, Vladimir Putin once again declared the need to continue massive strikes on peaceful Ukrainian cities. According to him, the strikes are on residential buildings, hospitals, poultry farms, meat processing plants, and warehouses, on household appliances, on Nova Poshta terminals, and so on and so on and so on. These are all strikes on facilities in Ukraine's military-industrial complex. Meanwhile, on the night of July 4, Ukraine's defense forces attacked an oil terminal in St. Petersburg. This is the hometown of the bald dictator Vladimir Putin. A large-scale fire is raging at the site. The president of Ukraine, Zelensky, stated, quote, "Last night, our Ukrainian long-range sanctions against Russia for this war took effect near Petersburg. Ukraine's defense forces struck oil infrastructure at the port that bankrolls Russia's war." There was also a strike on the Kronstadt base in the Leningrad region of the Russian Federation, which is an important military target. The distance from Ukraine's state border is more than 850 kilometers. Well,
is it worth it for them to hit editor of subtitles, Papa?
Subtitle editor N. Alexandrova. I would like to note that the St. Petersburg oil terminal is one of the key Baltic hubs for the export of Russian oil products. It provides tanker shipments to Africa, the Middle East, and other regions. This trade is an important source of replenishment for the enemy's military budget. I would also like to note that the alleged drone debris fell in the area of the Vysotsk port, one of the key ports of the Russian Federation in the eastern part of the Baltic Sea. The Petersburg oil terminal, which has strategic status, was previously attacked on the night of June 3rd. And as a result of that raid, which took place on the opening day of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, a large fire broke out on the terminal's territory, and another strike on the terminal occurred on June 6th. In total, on the night leading into Saturday, according to the report from the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, 389 Ukrainian aircraft-type drones were intercepted in 19 regions, as well as over the waters of the Azov and Black Seas. Russia is preparing for a new phase of the war and is creating all the conditions for mass mobilization. Vladimir Putin yesterday, during a meeting with the military, instructed to analyze Ukraine's allies' involvement in the war, whom he called instigators of the continuation of hostilities, in order to make responsible decisions regarding them in the future. But this is an obvious attempt at intimidation, like we'll figure out who is helping Ukraine, and in the future we'll decide to attack them. And it's funny that Putin says it's actually the Western countries that are inciting the continuation of hostilities. The solution is very simple. The war can end in a second. I'm not saying this to the unwashed Russians right now, just in a second. All Russians pack up their belongings, turn toward Moscow, and leave the territory of Ukraine. As soon as the last Russian crosses the border, the state border between Ukraine and Russia, that's it, the war is over. And there is no need for any instigators here, absolutely no one is needed. Each Russian just packs up their things and goes back to Russia. Believe me, no one will chase after you. No one will attack Russia after that. Once the last Russian crosses the border and leaves, that's it, the war is over. I guarantee you that's exactly how it will be. The war will end, Ukraine doesn't need Russian territories. This wild tribe, Ukrainians don't need it, the West doesn't need it, nobody needs it. Just live there in peace, that's it, the war will end, but that's a bit of a digression. So Vladimir Putin made a statement.
Also, there must be an ongoing analysis of each instigator's involvement in continuing the war in Ukraine. An analysis should be conducted of each one's involvement in actual combat operations. We need this analysis to possibly make responsible decisions in the future. In any case, we might need this.
And so, explaining his position, Vladimir Putin referred to a joint statement by a number of European Union leaders from June 7 in which, according to him, the innovative use of drone technologies by Ukraine was welcomed. Well then, Putin started repeating this propaganda line about how Europe supports these attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces that he made up, against children in dormitories, against buses with Belarusians, against civilian targets and civilian infrastructure on the territory of Russia, and so on and so forth. Well, Putin, of course, forgets to mention that the strikes are on military factories, oil refineries, energy facilities, logistics, and so on. Well, obviously we know why he's doing this. But the statement's point was different. Vladimir Putin was trying to intimidate the European allies. The thing is, already this morning, just last night, Putin was talking about assessing their involvement, and already this morning, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation stated that the Baltic states were involved in Ukraine's strikes on Russian infrastructure, amid new Ukrainian armed forces attacks on ports in St. Petersburg and Leningrad region. And next they will quote Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Galuzin. We have verified data that Latvia and other Baltic republics have already provided their air corridors for Ukrainian drones that attack the civilian infrastructure of our country. So, in other words, the Russian Foreign Ministry managed to quickly prepare a report for Putin overnight about the involvement of the Baltic countries in the war in Ukraine. Last time, a similar statement was made by the Russian Ministry of Defense. In May, this agency claimed that Ukrainian drones had tried, as they put it, to attack St. Petersburg through the territory of Latvia. Previously, a representative from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs made similar accusations against the Baltic countries and Finland. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Press Secretary Mashka Zakharova, and the Assistant to the President of Russia, Patrushev. In April, they stated that these countries were providing their airspace to Ukrainian drones for attacks on Russian territory. And against the backdrop of these threats from Vladimir Putin to the Baltic countries, the Russian Ministry of Defense proposed to cancel it completely. Mandatory medical examinations for contract soldiers and mobilized personnel which determine their fitness for military service. The corresponding draft amendments to the law have been published on the Legal Acts draft portal. The changes will be in effect during mobilization, martial law, or wartime, in other words, when Vladimir Putin needs more cannon fodder. The draft amendments introduce a new clause to Article 5.1 of the Federal Law on Military Duty, according to which medical examination becomes mandatory only in special cases. If the candidate has injuries, wounds, trauma, or a concussion, if there are diseases that make him eligible to be recognized as fit with limitations, or if there are diseases that make him unfit for service. Moreover, it is specified that this must be clearly visible. If the illness or injury isn't visible, he's automatically considered fit. And if a man does not have obvious, clearly visible injuries or diseases, then according to these amendments to the law, the Ministry of Defense sends this man to fight immediately. So there is no need for this military medical commission. And you know, it even seems logical. And the day before, experts from the New York Times wrote that after reaching combat positions, a Russian army recruit may survive for only 20 to 35 minutes. The main reason for the rapid deaths of Russian soldiers is the widespread and effective use of Ukrainian drones. And here's a story. Historian Peter Frankopan, citing Russian, let me emphasize Russian, military bloggers, writes that after being assigned to combat, a soldier in the Russian army can expect to survive from 10 days to 3 weeks, from arriving at the training ground to being killed in action. Most Russian recruits undergo only a few days of training before they are immediately sent to the front. As soon as they reach the combat position 20 to 35 minutes later, that's it, that Russian is dead. So why bother with some super complicated medical examination? At the same time, recruitment of new contract soldiers in Russia has dropped by 30% this year. That's why the Russian Ministry of Defense suggests that those liable for military service should not undergo a medical examination by default, but only in special cases if there are injuries or serious illnesses. Well, as you can imagine, no one is actually going to look for any serious illnesses, of course, when Vladimir Putin needs more cannon fodder to supply the front. And here, well, I just want to say, what more proof do you need that the Kremlin is really preparing a new wave of mobilization right after the elections in September? I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.